Good morning. Today I'm going to talk to you about maps and how understanding maps helps us understand our IT documentation and hopefully make it a bit better. Here's our first map of the day. You are here, hopefully, at the London VMUG. If not, I've got the wrong slide in. So I'm going to be talking about maps and IT documentation. And my suggestions today are platform independent. So if you're working with vSphere, great. But if you're working with Cloud Foundation, Power Platform, Azure, AWS, Windows, GCP, Linux, whatever, hopefully this is all relevant. And when I say documentation, I mean all sorts of things. So it could be your computer manual, your paper manual, if you've still got any of those. It could be your online knowledge base. It could be your user guide, your architecture diagrams, your FAQs, your blogs. Documentation is all-encompassing. So I'm Chris Bradshaw. I spend my days working as an IT engineer in higher education. Coincidentally, I think I'm the other side of that wall from where Sam was at the University of Surrey a few years ago. And I spend my time designing and building infrastructure with vSphere when I'm on premises, and usually Azure when I'm off in the cloud somewhere. And whilst doing this, I've fallen into being an unofficial owner, internal champion. There's not really a title for it, but of our IT knowledge base. Outside of the office, I have a blog, IT Should Just Work, and this is where I document the technical things that I learn for other people to enjoy, but also myself when I forget I've done something before. I have a Twitter account. I've also got some other social accounts in case Twitter doesn't exist at the end of the day. So last summer, I took a trip to the south coast of England, had a great day out walking with the family, and kind of provided the inspiration for this talk. Really got me thinking about the similarities between all the maps I was using on this journey and the documentation I was writing in my IT life. Now, my day out walking took me to a hill called Golden Cap. It's easy to see, there's a big red arrow above it. This is between Lyme Regis and Bridport, if you know the area. It's the highest point on the south coast of England. I think technically the highest sea cliff. But I had a lovely day out with the family. We drove along the coast to a National Trust car park. We went on a walk. We saw the sea down in the corner. And we had fish and chips for tea. And on this journey, I used several maps. So my first port of call for planning a walk in the UK would be the Ordnance Survey Explorer map. It's one of these, not this one, but this has a scale of 1 to 25,000. So 1 inch on here is 25,000 inches on the ground, if anyone can visualise that. Obviously, when you put it on this big screen, that's no longer to scale, but it's clear to read. There's lots of useful touristy information included. Here's the target of my walk. Again, that red arrow has reappeared. And there's lots of footpaths on here. So all these green dashes and dots and lines and diamonds and things are rights of way. That means me as a member of the public is allowed to wander along them. There's a nearby pub in the bottom corner there, you can just see next to that giant blue mug. And at the top on the right-hand side, there's a car park next to the big blue parking sign. And from the car park, I can see there's lots of paths going to where I want to go. So there's an opportunity for a nice circularish walk. I'm not retracing my steps. Now, the Ordnance Survey isn't the only player here. This is OpenStreetMap. So this is an online community-driven alternative. Okay? You can also buy maps from Harvey's, from A to Z, from Michelin, and so on. This map is showing you the same area as the previous one, but slightly different information. This one doesn't include rights of way explicitly, for example. It's got lots of paths on it, but it's not saying, you know, this is accessible by the public. But I have found this is more useful for finding those small local paths. You know, the community contributions, the open source nature of this really helps. But before I go on my walk, I need to get there in my car from home. And my favourite solution here is Google Maps. You know, this gives me nice, clear road networks. It gives me turn-by-turn navigation. A little voice in my head or the car talks to me and says, turn left and turn right and turn around when possible. Now, I'm of an age where I started driving before we had all that GPS. I'm sure many of you here are as well. And you had one of these, you know, an A to Z or a British road atlas. And you'd have this propped open on your dashboard. And that's how you're navigating. If you didn't have a passenger, you probably had it on the passenger seat and you were driving along like that navigating. Don't miss those days. But again, this is the same place, but a different map. This one is very good for driving. It's rubbish for going for a walk in the countryside. Great for driving to the car park. And to be fair, Google Maps is great when you're in town. You know, if you're on your way home to the station later, Google Maps will give you nice turn-by-turn navigation around the streets of London. But please don't rely on it if you're remotely out of sight of a road. You have arrived at your destination, says my car. And in the car park, we found a couple of information boards. Both of these had more maps on them. So this is the first one, and it's similar to the Ordnance Survey map. There's a few changes. The pub in Seatown seems to have been worryingly replaced with what looks like a cafe. North is to the right on this one rather than the traditional up. I guess that just makes it fit nicely in the box. But this map has information that's not on the other one. So this one's showing me wheelchair accessible paths, for example. It's the same place, it's a different map. And the second notice board next to that has two more maps. These are giving me a pseudo 3D representation of what the landscape looks like. So on my Ordnance Survey map, if I want to know where the hills are, there's lots of brown lines. Contour lines. They join places of equal height. And if I know how to interpret a map, I can look at them and go, oh yeah, there's a hill, there's a valley, there's a steep bit. If I'm not a map reader, then this gives me that information in a different view. I can look at that map picture and I can go, oh yeah, there's a bump there, I've got to walk around, and then I'll go down a bit, and then I go up what looks quite steep, and I'm at the top. So all these maps have their own purpose. And let's think about how that applies with our IT documentation. What is the purpose of our map? You know, were we getting there by car? Were we planning a route, a walk on foot? And they needed those different maps. And it's the same when we're writing our documentation. We need to consider the purpose. What's the reader going to be using our documentation for? Do they want to know how our system works, under the hood? Do they want to know how to do something in particular with our system? Maybe they want to know what our system is connected to. And all those purposes obviously need lots of different information included. But also think not just what you want to include, what you want to leave out as well. Because otherwise all your documents end up like War and Peace and you can't actually find the information you need. A good example of this, the Microsoft Azure documents that I read, they tell me how to configure a VNet, a virtual network in the Azure portal. It doesn't include the information about how to find the physical network switch in the Azure data center. I mean, it doesn't even tell me where the data center is. That's not the purpose of the documentation I'm reading. There's probably some documentation somewhere else for that other purpose, hopefully, but not the documents that I'm reading. And this all boils down to what question is our document answering. So every piece of documentation we write is really answering one or more questions. And as an aside, this also applies if you're ever making a dashboard. You know, we all make dashboards so we can see the state of our system, and sometimes we fall into that trap of just saying, well, I can make a graph of this, and oh, that's a nice pie chart. But really, we want to know what questions do I need to get the dashboard to answer? Do I want to know when my hard disks are full? You know, who's visiting the website? Where the peaks in network traffic are? And essentially, a dashboard is IT documentation. It's documenting the current recent state of my system. So we'll add that to the documentation pile. So you will find that every system you do will probably need more than one piece of documentation to meet these different purposes. You know, I've got this bit of documentation that tells me how to shut down the system. You know, that's like a how-to style article in my knowledge base. And I've got another bit that's telling me what network ports the things are connected on. You know, that might be a different article. That might be an architecture diagram with a nice picture with, like, these are the two bits of my system. There's a line in between them, and I'll put some TCP port numbers on it. As well as the purpose, we also have the audience. And these are often interlinked. But if you think back to that 3D picture on the sign in the car park versus the contour lines on my ordnance survey map, they were both answering the same questions. They both had the same purpose, you know, planning a walk in the countryside. But they had different audiences. One was for experienced map readers, the other one for more casual walkers. This is the same with our IT stuff. We have a technical audience. You lot here today would probably fall into that category. We also have our users, you know, who are less technical in our field, let's say. We have our C-level, our upper management, who are differently technical. For some of these groups and some purposes, we might want to give step-by-step guidance on how to do something. But for others, we can assume an existing skill set. It's important to say this isn't just is this a technical person or not? Do we use technical language or not? We need to dive a bit deeper. You know, I've got this bit of documentation aimed at my network team. This one's aimed at my virtual infrastructure admins. Maybe that one's written for my Windows admins. And each of these, we need to think about what level of detail we're including. What are those existing skill sets? But we also need to think a bit about what languages we should be using. So within that techie, we've got all those different areas, and they've each got their own lingo, their own acronyms, as well as the information they need. VMware admins, you'll understand terms like vSAN. You know what a DRS rule is. Our Windows admins might not know that. So we need to tailor our documentation to our audience. Bit of an admission here. Several months after our trip, I was explaining this talk to my teenage son, and he said, "Oh, that's just like the GCSE English we do at school." And he's right. I think we forget this, though, because we're not writing about Shakespeare anymore. Understanding the audience, the purpose, and the language of our writing doesn't just apply to school essays and university assignments. It's generic. It applies to our IT documentation as well. But don't worry, I'm not going to turn this into a school English lesson. We don't want one of those. I just thought it's important to highlight that this isn't just something about IT documentation. This is writing in general. So let's look at some documentation. Probably not the biggest bit of documentation you've ever seen, but let's think about how that audience and purpose looks like for an application infrastructure. So I'm going to use diagrams for this and flick through a few. You don't want to be reading pages of text of what good documentation might look like, and I don't want to be writing them or having them critiqued. So this is my web application. And on its own, yeah, this probably isn't the most useful bit of documentation. But from a user's point of view, that documents everything about the infrastructure that they need to know. The user will need other documents for other purposes, perhaps, like a user guide or a help sheet. But in terms of the IT infrastructure, the user just needs to go, there is an application. They don't care what's behind it. So behind it, we have a LAMP stack. You know, our Linux, MySQL, Apache, PHP, imagine that's drawn on there. This has a bit more information about those components. So the user didn't need to see this, but perhaps from a developer, that's all the information about the infrastructure that the developer needs. Sure, the developer's going to have other documents. They'll probably have one that tells them what tables are in the database or what headers the web server should be returning. But in terms of the infrastructure purpose, this might be all the information that the developer audience needs. Of course, our web app isn't sitting on a bit of bare tin. It's sitting on everybody's favourite hypervisor. So the audience for this bit of documentation might be our virtual infrastructure admin. So that audience is obviously more focused on managing the infrastructure supporting the OS. So in this document, we've left out all that detail within what's going on in the virtual machine. That audience doesn't need that for their purpose. And we're remembering we need to remember what to leave out as well as what to include. Our network guys are a bit different, and their diagram looks totally different. But this view, again, it's answering questions about the network. You know, how are things connected together? When traffic isn't reaching our web application, where did it get lost? So obviously these diagrams are simplified, but hopefully they illustrate the idea that there's a need for different documentation for different purposes and different audiences. Our documentation needs to be accessible in that the right people, the audience, can find the right document when they need to. So those fixed map boards I saw in the car park were great. You know, lots of information there, but they're no use to me when I'm a mile away on the next hill. Can your staff, can your users get to the documentation they need when they need it? And from wherever they might be. So, does your documentation need to be accessible remotely? These days, probably. Think a bit about where it's hosted. You know, there's no point putting the copy of your vSphere documentation in your knowledge base when your knowledge base is hosted on a VM that's hosted in your vSphere environment. You know, the instructions for fixing the broken thing are securely stored on the broken thing. Is your documentation discoverable? Can you search for the thing you want? Do you have an index to find your way? Think a bit about the media. You know, usually when we talk about IT documentation, we're talking about texts and diagrams. But what about video? What about audio? You know, personally, I don't like sitting through a 10-minute YouTube video and I have 6 minutes of somebody telling me to like and subscribe. I have a couple of advert breaks because I haven't paid for YouTube, and eventually get to something that's like, well, that could have been a paragraph and a picture. But sometimes it's useful. Some audiences would expect to consume their information by video. I know my kids do. Some purposes it fits. A good example of this, I was fixing something on my car and I needed to take the door panel off the inside of the door. And I undid 3 screws and gave it a wiggle and nothing happened. So I went online, and I found an article and it said, all right, what you need to do is undo the 4 screws and then take the door panel off. So I went along and I undid the 4 screws and gave it a pull, and there's a bit of a creak, but no movement. So I went back and I found a video. And I watched a video, and there's a mechanic taking a door panel off a similar car to mine. And she undoes the 4 screws. It's like, yeah, I've done that. And then without saying anything, she puts her foot at the bottom of the door, grabs hold of the top of the panel and goes, "Rrr!" Big pull, and the door panel comes off. It's like, no one's mentioned this, but the video has given me that information. So I go back to my car, check the 4 screws are still undone, put my foot on the bottom, put it on the top. There isn't a shower of little bits of plastic that I was expecting, and I got the door panel off. So in that case, whilst me as the audience probably wouldn't usually watch a video, the purpose actually made the video was the best kind of documentation there. These are all generally online. But do you need an offline copy? Obviously, if you're doing video, you might have to make a few flickbooks to do that. But some documentation, you do need an offline copy. How to recover your online system is useful to have written down somewhere. Is your documentation going to be read on a monitor if it's online? A nice big screen. It might be, but it might be being read on a smaller laptop screen. Possibly on someone who's got the laptop balanced on their knee round the back of a rack in a data centre. They might be trying to read it on a mobile screen, even smaller. So if you've got this nice big diagram that shows how everything's connected and what it should look like, but they're sat there pinching and scrolling and, only seeing a little bit of the picture at the same time, that doesn't work. It could be written on a dead tree. We do still have books and manuals. I work at a university and we still go in for putting posters up on the walls telling people how to print and things like that. If you're going to do that, think about the medium. Don't put clickable links on it. They don't work. If you're writing a URL out, don't write a really long one. People aren't going to sit there typing that in, or they're going to get it wrong. I've seen people do this. I've seen people use URL shorteners, but not nice ones. So you've got like 12 characters of alphanumeric text with various cases that they've got to get exactly right, or they get some, gambling site. Use a QR code. If it's a poster on a wall, especially, stick a QR code on it. Everyone can come out with their phone, clunk, right, I've got the web address. Don't put a QR code in your online documents, because I get this as well. You'll get sent a PDF document and it's got a QR code. Click, scan this for further information. I'm reading this on my phone. So the only way I can scan that QR code, because it's not clickable, is to print it out and then take a picture of it with my phone, or get a second phone and take a picture of the first phone. Think about that medium. Now, having said all of this, the documentation tools you've got might be prescribed by your organisation. There is a big case for making an effective use of what you've got, finding some wiggle room. I use Atlassian Confluence as our knowledge base software. Great bit of software. Our operations team use this and they put all their, information in there on how to fix things, what to do when you get this error message, how things are connected together and so on. our developers sat over, in Visual Studio Code or something, probably talking to an Azure DevOps or a GitHub repository. And it really makes sense for the developers to have their documentation next to their code in that repository. It's kept next to the code, so it's all version controlled with the code, which is great. It's still backed up and looked after, even though it's not in our knowledge base. And when our operations team are searching our knowledge base, they're finding the things they want about how to fix something and how something's connected together. They're not finding these are the tables in the database and this is what line 17 of the code was actually meant to do. Those documents are separate. It's a nice division. It works for us. And we're still, using the prescribed tools. This is all about making sure your documentation lives somewhere that the people who can find it can do so when they need to. Don't hide it away. Don't put it in a bottom of a filing cabinet or a binder in your desk that nobody else knows about, or your personal OneNote or Evernote, or, make sure people can get to it when they need to. So as well as all of that, our documentation needs updating, and so do our maps. So what can we do to make sure that these are maintained, and easy to update? So over time, the landscape changes. The map representing that landscape will change. And in IT, we have very few systems and services that will go through their entire life cycle without changes. And even if they do, there's probably errors in the original documentation that might need correcting. So here's two maps. This one on the left is OpenStreetMap. And I was on another walk through the countryside at some point, and I found some information that wasn't on the map. This is built on community suggestions, so I was able to go online, submit my addition to it. It got published and improved the map. On the right, we have a Google Maps page. And again, me, citizen of the world, I'm not a Google employee. I'm not even an employee of the pub involved here. I suggested an update to this map. I found some information that was missing. I suggested that update online. There's an approvals process. And then it's published into Google Maps. And when I took this screenshot, 130,000 people had looked at that, and hopefully some found it useful. And this can work for our documentation as well. So this is Microsoft's Azure documentation on MS Learn, if anyone's used that. And I updated this documentation. I'm a user. I'm not a Microsoft employee. But I spotted where something had changed and the documentation hadn't kept up. Every page in here has an edit link, which takes you to a GitHub page. It's all backed by GitHub. So I, made a correction. I submitted a pull request or whatever. An approvals process happened because they don't just want everyone graffitiing on the site. And it got published. And I got my avatar in the list of contributors. So can your users edit your user-facing documentation? That's quite a big step. Your internal documentation might be a bit more open. Perhaps you're allowing anyone in IT to edit it. I really like this way as a method of encouraging openness, contributions from across an organisation or department. If everyone can edit the documentation, even if it's just I've corrected a spelling mistake or I've added a better screenshot in, this all helps and makes everyone, feel part of it. And in your internal stuff, do you need that approval process? Yeah? Or does everybody's job description have something along the lines of they must be able to communicate clearly and document their work. You know, I know mine did. If they do, just trust people to do it. And you've got version history if, you know, it all goes wrong. So think about who can write and who can edit your docs. And does that documentation need approval before publishing? And the tool you're using will come into play here. But, you know, is it a wiki, a content management system, like the Confluence I'm using? Is it GitHub and a publishing workflow like Microsoft have? It could be Word docs and Visio in a, you know, SharePoint repository or something. All these tools have that permissions, have that approvals workflow. And while we're talking about updates, think about the updates of the tool itself. You know, a new version of the tool comes out, you can usually install that and take your data with you. You know, that's fairly normal. But what happens if another tool from another manufacturer comes out and you want to switch to that to get some great features or a cheaper bill? Can you pick your data up and move to that system? Your company might merge with another one and somebody up there flicks a coin and says, we're going to use their document management system. Can you get your data from your system into theirs? So if you're ever involved in putting one of these systems in, you know, at the ground floor, make sure that's in your requirements. Can I get the data out at the end? And if you're looking after a system at the moment and you're not sure whether you can get it out at the end, start looking at that now. Don't wait for that, you know, coin flick to happen and then, oh, panic. As long as everything else with the merger, I've now got to, you know, work out how an API works or something. This is VMware's documentation. So we're all VMware users here, or possibly even work for VMware. So here's a correction being submitted to VMware's documentation. I was involved in a Twitter chat online, and we found something that looked a bit wrong in the vSphere documentation. Again, I'm a customer, I'm not an employee of VMware. So I looked at the website and there's a feedback link and you can say, oh, I found some incorrect information. I provided some details, I provided some contact information. Yeah, this was the 14th of April this year. It's now, well, tomorrow's the 14th of July. I haven't heard anything back and the document's still wrong. So, you know, if anyone does work for VMware, maybe there's a takeaway for you. Talking of which, I'm coming towards the end. Went on this walk and we had fish and chips for tea at the end. That's my joke, by the way, the takeaway. The badum-tish noise didn't work on the laptop. But seriously, I'd like to, you know, give you these 4 things to think about when you're writing IT documentation.
Was it cod or haddock?
It's just fish. You don't ask. Think about the purpose. You know, your documentation should be answering a question. What's that question? Think about your audience. You know, who's going to read this? You know, what format is it in that they can take it in properly? Think about the location. In particular, how is your audience going to find it when they need to? And think a bit about the updates. Is this documentation updatable? You know, who's doing those updates? Is there an approval process around those updates? And I think overall, I'll leave you with this. Please remember that some documentation is usually better than none. Thank you very much. Are there any questions or, you know, contributions from you lot?
Yeah. So, good question. There's this thing that goes around about someone who's cleaning an aeroplane
How do you get documentation such that it's actually valid end to end, so you don't get stuck somewhere in the middle? That's something.
So yeah, how do you get your documentation valid from end to end? I think part of it is making sure that all the right people can contribute to it. You want the person you've got the person who's writing how to take off in a plane, who knows all about that, writing their document. You also need to make sure that the person who writes about landing a plane can also submit that document. And making sure you've got the right question for your document. Obviously they've got a document of how do you fly a plane? That's the question they used to write that. There wasn't the question of how do you take off, fly, and land a plane. Maybe that was the right question in that way. There's always going to be holes in our documentation, I think. I've never worked with any product where everything is documented. I think there's always going to be gaps. But it's being able to do something when we find those gaps. And hopefully not at the point that we're in the plane trying to land and then find that there's a gap.
I think the way to do that is set the scope at the beginning of the document. This document is intended to tell you how to do X. But it's valid use case. It's the same, right? People who have a DR document who expect it to take them through soup to nuts all the way through to rebuild something, when actually what you're telling someone to do is just physical server and rack and put it there. We're not software, not X.
Cool. Well, thank you very much.
Maybe the manual just has a color code. It's red because it ain't complete.
Yep.
It's orange. It's still not complete, but it's almost complete. And it's green when it's done. And then you RTFM it.
Yeah, but again, as long as that manual, you know it's not complete because there's an entire if someone's looking for a manual for this bit of the process, then that bit is complete. But if someone else comes along and wants that landing the plane as well as taking it off and expects the document to have that, so yeah, clearly defining what your document's for, knowing that question. But yeah, once you've got that, it's like, yeah, we've done this. But yeah, definitely flag up if you've half written something and they're going to come back to it later.
You do find that quite a lot with community maintained documentation. Nobody ever wants to say this is final, which is why everything is always like version 4.99999. Because as soon as someone says it's final and they've got something wrong, it's their fault. I've put it out loads. You never want to say it's done. It's always the work process.
Cool.
Isn't that why you should sort of say, well, this is done, but someone else is going to review it in 3 months? There's going to be a period. It's valid, but I'm letting go of this.
Yeah.
And my name's coming back on.
And that date was 6 months ago.
You need that work finding dev, work finding my laptop.
This is why the original websites that we all had that under construction logo on that never left. Yeah, put that at the top of your documentation. Leave it there. Job done. Cool. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Chris. Right. Quick break.